We're contenders, man. They didn't make the playoffs last year, but we're looking to change that and win big. The ring is the ultimate goal for everybody on the team. I know it is for me. When they talked to me and told me about the pieces they were adding alongside the players who were already there, I didn't think anything less than a championship. We're trying to get the Knicks back into the playoffs and win big. Everybody is hungry and everybody has their own motivation or chip on their shoulder. We just need to come together, get that chemistry and see it click. Once everybody is together and everybody is hungry, I think we can be very scary.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily podcast on fantasy basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Fantrax and Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and as always you can find me on Twitter at redrock_bball. We are back with another of the season preview podcasts. We're 3 down. This is the 4th one. We're still in the Eastern Conference for these season previews. No East Coast bias here. It's just the way that it's working out at the moment. We're going to be covering the New York Knicks in today's podcast if you couldn't tell from the opening quote. And to help me talk everything about the New York Knicks, I'm joined by the host of the Locked On Knicks podcast, Jared Dubin. Jared, how you going?
I'm doing great, man. How about you? Thanks for having me.
I'm good. It's good to have you on. And as I mentioned, Jared, you are the host of the Locked On Knicks podcast. So give the podcast a plug. What episodes you might have recently recorded or you've got coming up, and anything else you want to give a plug. Let's get that out of the way now.
Yeah, well, we did 2 episodes this week. This is Friday that we're recording this. We had one earlier in the week with Matt Moore, from CBSSports.com, talking about Phil Jackson and the Triangle Offense. And then one on Wednesday afternoon with Chris Herring of the Wall Street Journal, talking about Carmelo Anthony and athlete activism, how the reaction to Carmelo's activism differed from that of Colin Kaepernick, all different things about the treatment of people of different races in the country and how athletes have spoken out on it. And it's a really interesting podcast. Chris had great stuff on that, and we had a really good talk about it.
I recommend that you go and listen to both those. Matt's everyone knows Matt from CBS Sports and on Twitter at HP Basketball, the founder of Hardwood Paroxysm, and Chris is fantastic. I've heard him a couple of times. I think I heard him on Tim Bontemps' podcast at one stage. Yep. He's awesome at that. I haven't listened to your one yet, but I will definitely. It's in my queue to get around to it. But I do suggest that everyone subscribes to Locked On Knicks as well as this podcast, and leave us both a 5-star review and a rating would be great as well, just to get the word out. Retweet it and definitely listen to those shows. So Jared, let's talk New York Knicks. In all these preview podcasts, and once I opened the site over at Basketball Monster, myself and Matt and Kyle over there, we've asked 3 questions about each team. We're each giving an answer over in some written form over there, but I'm throwing those 3 questions to each of these guests that I have on these podcasts. So you're the Knicks guy, so let's talk about the 3 questions we've got set out here for the Knicks. And the first one is, will the presence of Derrick Rose hinder or help Kristaps Porzingis?
I think I'm of 2 minds about this. I think that, undoubtedly it will reduce the number of touches he had from last season, just because Rose has the ball so much in his hands, and if he doesn't, then he's not going to be much of a help to anyone, because he's not a shooter and he's not necessarily a guy that is making a ton of cuts that draw the defense either. It's, he's attacking with the ball in his hands, or he's a negative on offense. And the fact that he's going to have the ball so much, and obviously we know with the Knicks, Carmelo is going to have the ball so much. So Kristaps will touch the ball less, I think. But there are also situations, because of what Rose does when he does have the ball, that will create easier baskets for Kristaps. And that's not even necessarily off the pass, And Kristaps himself mentioned this in an interview earlier this summer. When Rose goes to the basket and he misses a layup, that's an opportunity for him to get those tip slams that he loves. And because Rose draws so much attention on his way to the basket, that opens up even more of those opportunities than maybe he had last season. The big thing that people have focused on with Rose is that pick and pop game with Porzingis, and that's where the biggest question mark comes for me. I don't necessarily know how much that's going to work for the two of them. Teams tend to go under the screen on Rose so they can cut off his drive, and if they're doing that, then the big man isn't necessarily having to cut off the path to the basket as well. And Kristaps may not be as wide open as people think for those pop out threes off pick and pops.
So he's sort of projecting as a third option on offense, which I don't think is ideal for this team and for him moving forward. Melo's going to get the bulk of the shots, Rose probably second, and then you have Kristaps coming in as that third option. But I see it sort of balancing out a little bit from last season. All those things you mentioned are true, and the attention that Rose draws is massive, and we know how well Kristaps played in terms of finishing up those misses last season. And when he's got more of an opportunity, instead of it being Jose Calderon driving and it's Derrick Rose, and there's two guys heading towards Rose, and then he can come in from the side, that helps. But I think that Porzingis plays significantly more minutes this season, so his overall production should look improved, but it might not necessarily on a per minute basis be a huge increase, which you generally expect from a first to second year player. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. He only played like 28 minutes a game last year, I think. Per 36, he was 18 points, 9 rebounds, I think almost 2.5 blocks a game.
Yeah.
That's already, if he actually played 36 minutes, that's, close to all-star big man level numbers, assuming that he keeps, his defensive bona fides that he showed last year up at the same level. But I don't necessarily think he makes a leap above those numbers per 36. It may look like his numbers got better if he plays 8 more minutes a game. Let's say he gets to 18 and 9. That would be terrific. But that would also be keeping up basically the same level of production. I think he might do it on a slightly more efficient basis, just because you'd expect his 3-point percentage to go up this year, and that was about a quarter of his shots last season. And this is something Chris Herring has written about, and I've talked about on the Locked On Knicks podcast, where European guys that come over do tend to improve their 3-point shooting as they get older, and especially over their first season. The one guy that wasn't true of was Andrea Bargnani, and I think we all think that Kristaps is not going to wind up being a Bargnani. So I would imagine that his outside shooting will improve, and that would raise his level of efficiency.
Yeah, I think that's almost a guarantee. Like, he was 42% from the field last season and just 33% from three. And if he just jumps those up by 1.5%, 2%, like that almost offsets Derrick Rose maybe not taking a shot out of his hand, but taking a potential increase in shots out of his hand. I still think Porzingis is going to be monstrous this season. I think he's going to put together really, really big numbers. And you reference 18 and 9. I think that he can get to that, not even in playing 36 minutes. And, blocking shots and hitting 1.5 threes a game and being efficient from the free throw line. I think people are going to be surprised that playing an extra 5 minutes a night, which is what I think he can do this year, it puts such a big boost onto numbers. It's a significant amount. That's almost it's almost 20%
like a 20% increase, exactly.
Yeah, it's such a big difference. Plus, I think that Hornacek, and I hope that he plays at a slightly elevated pace as well, which increases his numbers too. Do you think Hornacek will do that? Will increase the pace?
You would hope so. They've been talking about it a lot, and it's something that fits well with both of the point guards they signed in Rose and Brandon Jennings. But we've seen, I think, Knicks teams and Carmelo Anthony teams talk before about increasing the pace and getting up and down the floor. And, Carmelo's teams tend to play around the same pace, other than those, I think it was his last 2 years in Denver and his 2 years with Mike D'Antoni. For the most part, Carmelo teams aren't all that fast. So it'll be interesting to see that push and pull between, the point guards and Hornacek, and Kristaps being a good fit for that as well. And even guys like Courtney Lee or Kuzminskis, who they signed over the summer, being good fits for faster-paced offenses. But then you look at somebody like Joakim Noah is probably more of a half-court slowdown guy at this point. Carmelo has always been more of that. So, I would expect they won't be the slowest team in the league like they've been. I don't know if they were actually the slowest last year, but it was pretty close. So I'd expect at least a few possessions increase, but not necessarily seeing them playing, 100 possession games. Like, if they can get up into the mid 90s rather than the low 90s, I think that's an improvement for them.
Yeah, I think last season they went at about 95 possessions a game, which is pretty slow. So I think that they should be able to increase on that. Now you mentioned Joakim Noah. That's our next question that we're going to ask. The question that we asked here is can Joakim Noah be standard league fantasy relevant for the entirety of the season? Now I'm not going to ask you the fantasy portion of that, but let's transition to that. Can Noah be useful? Can he play a decent amount of minutes? Can he regain some of the form? No, he's not going to get back to that form that saw him finish top 5 in the MVP and be Defensive Player of the Year. I don't think anyone expects that. But can he be better than what we've seen from last season?
Well, I think the fantasy question and the encore question are both related to the same issue. It's just, can he stay healthy?
Yep.
He played 29 games last season. Missed 15 games, I think, the season before. Has had seasons where he's missed 18 games, 34 games. Before the 2 seasons where he played 80 out of 82 one year, played 80 out of 82 earlier in his career, 74 out of 82. So, I mean, over the last few years, he's not really played that much. I think in the last 2 years, he's actually played fewer games than Rose.
Yeah, that's
right. He only played 29 last season and 67 the season before. And, those 2 seasons, he's on a trend now of 5 years in a row, his field goal percentage has gone down.
Yep.
2010-11, 52.5, then 50.8, 48.1, 47.5, 44.5, finally all the way down to 38.3 last year. He did do better rebounding last season, and I think his assist numbers might have been up as well.
Yeah, they were.
But the steals and blocks have been going down a little bit. The efficiency has been going down. The thing about it is that the Knicks aren't counting on him, I think, to do quite as much as he did in Chicago. It's more going to be on the court for 20, 25 minutes a night, play defense, do some facilitating from the elbows. I really don't think he's going to be counted on to do much more than that. Hopefully that will help him stay healthy, but I do think that minimizes, I know you're going to address this question on your own, but I do think that minimizes the fantasy impact if he's not touching the ball as much. He's not going to have, I don't think, the 4, 5, 6 assist averages just because, he's going to be 4th or maybe even 5th in the pecking order for touches on offense in the starting lineup.
So you mentioned his minutes, saying 20 to 25 minutes. I would have thought he could have. I don't think he gets to 30, but I thought he would have, maybe high 20s, 28-ish minutes. If he's only getting 25, what are the Knicks doing then at center? They're playing Porzingis more at the 5. Who's getting in there? Is it going to be Hernan Gomez? Are they going to finally get KOQ Quinn onto the court? How are they going to fill the rest of those minutes out if you don't think that Noah's capable of playing close to 30?
Yeah, I don't think that they should want him to play close to 30 because they should want him to be healthy. So to me, the 25 range is what they should be targeting. And then, Kristaps at center for, 10-plus minutes a night, I would think is a good idea. Hernan Gomez, KOQ Quinn, I think both of those guys can potentially factor in. They signed Marshall Plumlee. I don't think he's necessarily going to play all that much. But if they, again, decide that they don't like what they see from O'Quinn, then I would imagine he'd be the guy in the mix after that, after O'Quinn and Hernan Gomez. I don't imagine that they're going to go crazy small with Carmelo at center at all, just because that takes both Noah and Kristaps off the court and doesn't use any of the backups. But I think if Noah winds up around that 25-minute mark, then it will be, Kristaps for 12 minutes at center, and then 12 minutes for Hernan Gomez or KOQ Quinn, whoever winds up winning that job.
If Noah gets 25 minutes a night, there is no chance that he should have any place in any fantasy league. Even if he gets 29 minutes, he's a borderline guy. The percentages kill you. I think he shot 40% from the free throw line last season or something horrible like that.
49.
Yeah, 49%, 38% from the field. That is just dreadful. And it's not on a huge amount of attempts, but it's enough to really impact you. He scored 4 points a game in 22 minutes. So that is it's almost unfathomably low. And you could concede that he was in a bad situation. He was playing off the bench, but Melo Porzingis, Rose, these guys are still going to be taking shots, and Noah's just, you touched on it, he's just not going to be touching the ball. He might, maybe he doesn't get to the 9 rebounds he got last season in 22 minutes, which is a pretty decent rate, because Porzingis will be getting
really good.
Yeah, it's at 11 and a half. Oh, sorry, 14 and a half per 36, which is a tremendous rate, which is up 3 per 36 over his last season's performance. But does he do it playing next to Porzingis?
The rebounding and shot blocking too. I think a lot of that is going to depend on which of him and Kristaps the teams decide they want to put directly in the pick and roll.
Yep.
It might be that they say, we want to test Kristaps' pick and roll defense, and then Noah will wind up being more of the rim protector and the rebounder. But then they might say, Kristaps moves at this point so well. He's much lighter on his feet, I think, than 31-year-old Noah. So maybe they say, we want to test Noah in pick and rolls, and then his numbers might not be as good fantasy-wise, even while at that point he'd probably be having more of an on-court impact as the guy directly involved in the action.
Yeah, I can't see any way that I'd be looking at Noah in any sort of fantasy situation. It's just not. Look, I think that Porzingis' best position is the 5 anyway, and they will see that Noah is better in a limited role, and that will play Porzingis there more and will limit what Noah can do. He's just not getting those minutes. He's not getting those touches. He's hurting you in too many areas. So he's definitely not someone for me. I'm not really keen on a bounce back. We'll talk about another player who's looking for somewhat of a bounce back, and that's Brandon Jennings. He didn't put up good numbers last season, but it's to be expected. Anyone who's coming back from an Achilles surgery, let alone a point guard who relies upon speed and explosiveness, they're just not going to be the same player. And he possibly will never be the same player again, but that's what I want to ask you. Can he return to some of the form that we saw from him in Detroit? Because there's definitely going to be games where he's going to get starts, because we know that Rose isn't going to play 82 games. Jennings is going to get starts. Can he get back to that same level of play, or do you have concerns like I do?
Yeah, I definitely have concerns. You look at the history of Achilles injuries, there is not one player that returned to the same level of production that they had before the injury. I'm looking at a chart from a couple of years ago in front of me, just with the notable guys that suffered that injury. It's Jonas Jerebko, Dan Dickau, Elton Brand, Mehmet Okur, Dominique Wilkins, Gerald Wilkins, LaFonso Ellis, Christian Laettner, Stanley Roberts, Mo Taylor, Vashawn Leonard, Kobe Bryant, Jeff Taylor, Chauncey Billups, and then we added Wes Matthews to that list last year, plus Brandon Jennings.
And Anderson Varejao.
And Anderson Varejao. And I mean, the only guy that even approached, a truly respectable level after that, approximating what he had done before was Elton Brand. Everybody else completely fell off the mat and was like absolutely nothing like what they were before. Maybe Dominique Wilkins as well was somewhat close, but not nearly, the explosion that he had prior to the injury. And he was already in his 30s when he suffered the injury. Jennings is younger, so there's not quite as large a sample size of that. But even the guys that suffered the injury in their 20s, you look at Stanley Roberts, Mo Taylor, Christian Laettner even, LaFonso Ellis, none of these guys rebounded to their previous level. It's just not something that happens. The injury is too tough. But, then you look, Jennings only played 18 minutes a game last year. He was his usual sporadically effective self and not very efficient at all. I would imagine he's going to play more than that this season, even just in his capacity as this 6th or 7th man. And then he's also going to get, I think, more than 7 starts this season, because Derrick Rose isn't playing all 82 games. He's not playing 75 games. He's just, the likelihood of him being healthy for the whole season is extraordinarily low. And at that point, Jennings will be counted on to do even more than what he's going to be counted on as, one of the first 2 guys off the bench.
Yeah, I think that's all exactly my thoughts on it. You just don't come back from this injury ever to the same sort of level. Jennings, you might look at Jennings' shooting and go, yeah, he shot 37% from the field. Yeah, I know he's a bad shooter, but that's still the worst that he's really ever shot. So it's still a downgrade. He was at over 40% the year before. He saw his free throw percentage drop to 73, down from 84. And you might say, but what does that mean? He's not moving when he's taking free throws, but it's all to do with sort of body balance and positioning and comfort level with where your foot's... It's just a whole different thing because your whole body over that rehab period is trying to relearn to run the same as before and take the mental side out of it and stand in the right way. And all of that's part of it. You saw Wes Matthews...
Free throws maybe even more lower body
Yep.
than straight up jump shots, just because you're completely stationary. Most guys don't jump at all. They maybe go on their toes or lean forward a little bit. So it's so much more stress on that lower leg. And that's something that you have to get used to over time.
Yeah, look, and that might, and it will improve this season. I'm pretty sure that both of those things will improve, but they probably won't go back up to being a 40 and 84 shooter, which he was before the injury went down. So to me, Jennings is going to be someone that when he gets a start, sure, add him because you might get 6 or 7 assists out of him. He might hit a 3. He might get you 14 points, but to rely upon him as a long-term solution, or to even think that he returns to that value that he had back when he was with Detroit, I don't think that's probably all that smart at this point. But you never know. Maybe he's the guy that bucks the trend. I'm not all that convinced about it. This is normally...
No, look, it's entirely possible that he winds up being more effective than Rose.
Yeah,
there is a scenario where that happens. Whether it's because Rose isn't on the court or Rose can't recapture what he had before. It's not like peak Jennings was all that efficient or effective, but he did put up numbers.
Yeah, look, he did. He was inefficient, but he could go out there and get you 18 and 7 and get 1.5 to 2 steals and hit a couple of threes and do it poorly and do it not necessarily to the benefit of the team, but the numbers would look enticing. And he was a guy that, often people have fantasy biases at Jared, and they'll look at him and go, "Oh, Jennings, he's trash. I can't stand him. He's a poor shooter." And go, "That's fine." But when he gets 18.7 assists, 2 steals, I'm still pretty happy with that from a fantasy point of view. But in a situation like this where he's not the starter and he's got this injury concern, then I just don't have confidence that he does that as consistently as what he did before. This is normally the portion of the show where we talk about the young incoming 2016 draft picks, Jared. But unfortunately, it's blank.
Yeah, I love the Knicks draft pick this year. It was great.
Yep, it's
good pick.
At least none of them will be busts. We can we'll frame it in a positive sense. But what we can do is we can talk about Billy Hernangomez, who's coming across, because he's basically their draft choice because they picked him, or they didn't pick him. The Sixers picked him last season and traded him on draft night with a very early second round selection. He was the backup center for Spain in the Olympics, playing behind Pau Gasol, and now he's coming over. What do we think he just slots directly into that backup center role behind Noah, or is he behind O'Quinn to start the season? How do you see Hernangomez fitting in, and what do you know about him?
Yeah, I think that will probably be something that's hashed out in training camp. The battle between him and O'Quinn, if you can call it that. Maybe the Knicks really do play 2 true big men at all times. I would be surprised, just based on what I know of Hornacek's coaching style, if they did play 2 real big men at all times and wound up playing O'Quinn and Hernangomez together. I think if he does win that job, it's going to be a 12 to 15 minute kind of thing, and he'll get some post-up opportunities, he'll get some rebounds. I could see him being a marginally efficient scorer just because he does have a good back-to-the-basket game, but I think it's something that you saw in the Olympics, his lack of burst off the ground. He's a very ground-bound player. I think could lead to him getting his shot blocked a bunch and not necessarily being quite as effective because he's not yet stronger than all the guys he's going to be going up against. As he matures and gets older and he develops a little bit more strength, he'll be able to move guys with that shoulder and get that flip shot up that he has up before they can recover and block it. But for now, I don't think he's necessarily strong enough to just move guys out of the way like he did some in Spain a couple of years ago, and that could hinder his effectiveness a little bit.
For those of you that don't know, Hernangomez was Porzingis' teammate back at Sevilla in their draft year. Then he moved across to Real Madrid last season, and he didn't play a huge amount over there. Obviously, it's a
he barely played at all last season.
Well, the Knicks have got a couple of people coming across from Real Madrid. They will head into their free agency signings now, because one of the players they did bring across is Maurice Ndua, who was one of the Knicks, cult heroes in the 2015 Summer League. He was
Yep.
really, I don't know, is that the best way to describe it? Because he was people just
No,
got excited
that's
watching him.
100% cult hero. People loved him.
And then he signed with Dallas, got cut, and went across to Spain, and literally barely saw the court. I think he played about 8 minutes a night, didn't play in majority of the games, but he's back, and he joins a group of Knicks. And look, they didn't have a draft choice, but they've got 5 rookies coming across. They've got Hernan Gomez and Nadua coming across from Real Madrid. They've got Marshall Plumlee, as you touched on already, an undrafted rookie. They've got Mindaugas Kuzminskas, who you already touched on, and Chasen Randall is coming across from Russia as well. So they've got a stack of rookies, and this adds to their bench depth, which I think is a real concern, given there's just so many unproven players. We've talked about Plumlee a little bit already. How does Kuzminskas look? Because his defense is going to be a real concern, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you there, and I think you saw that in the Olympics as well. The encouraging thing in the Olympics, though, is that he played basically the same role for his national team that I would expect if he does win minutes that he'll play with the Knicks. He was sort of a supplementary offensive player, shooting some threes, attacking some closeouts, getting out on the break, and I think you saw that he could do all 3 of those things. He's not a high-level guy at any of them, except maybe getting out on the break. But if he finds guys to run with him, then he can, be effective in that role. It won't be for very many minutes. The high minute bench guys likely are going to be Lance and Jennings. And even after that, I think you're more likely to see whoever of O'Quinn and Hernan Gomez wins that role, and then maybe Justin Holiday, just because they really don't have a backup 2 guard.
Yep. You're not counting Sasha?
Yeah, I mean, look, if Kurt Rambis was the coach, then I would say, yeah, Sasha's going to play a bunch. I would hope and expect that Jeff Hornacek will end that experiment, but, who knows? But, yeah, I mean, Mindaugas, I think if he plays, can be effective in short bursts against benches, but he'll get in trouble defensively, and especially if he winds up having to guard more athletic guys that are typically starters.
Yeah, the defense will be an issue. Look, he can score, but the bench depth, there is a chance for him to get, especially if, say, Thomas has to miss any time, which he missed some time last season. If Holiday doesn't work out, if it depends on how they want to run it, but he's definitely not their worst bench player. I wouldn't say he's got a role there for him as a sort of a perimeter based scorer who is going to have some issues. What about Chasen Randall? He is, to me at this point, he's probably the favourite for the 15th spot on the roster. He's also got Ron Baker and JP Tokoto to battle. Who do you think gets that role? Because I look at it in Randall and go, they just need a third point guard. They don't have a third point guard.
Yeah, I think they definitely need a third point guard, but I also think that that's something that's going to come down to a camp battle as well. I know they liked Baker as sort of like a triangle style point guard. He's not necessarily someone who's going to have the ball in his hands all the time, but can set up the offense and then shoot off of the other guys on the court. And that's something that can work well when you have, high usage small forward in Carmelo, a guy you'd like to touch the ball a lot in Kristaps, and even another guy who can help you run the offense in Noah. So, that's something that could fit decently well for him, and I think works to his advantage. Where Randall doesn't necessarily have the same kind of shooter's skill set. So he's more, I think, of a natural point guard, but that might not necessarily be what the Knicks are looking for in that spot. It's just a matter of what they prefer.
Regardless, neither of those guys has got massively high ceilings. It's going to have much of an impact really in any sort of fantasy league. But a guy that will is the last of their free agent acquisitions, and that's Courtney Lee, who was started the season for Memphis, traded to Charlotte, started pretty much every game last season. He comes across, slots into the starting shooting guard role. That was him at the start of this show who gave that quote saying, championship and we're all joining together, chips on ash, whatever he was saying at the start. That was him. Courtney Lee
Yeah.
joins. What does he? How does his role change? Because to me, he has been one of the kings in terms of statistical production of doing the least with the most. So he'd get the most minutes and just do nothing with them. Like he just doesn't touch the ball. He plays really solid on ball defense. He can get an occasional steal, but he just doesn't get involved enough with rebounding or assists or shooting volume of threes. How does he fit in with this team? Do you think that he can take a step forward, or will all these other usage high players really just relegate him to the same sort of role he's had throughout his career?
Yeah, I think he's probably going to wind up playing pretty much the same role. I think he might wind up playing more minutes, though, because the Knicks really don't have anybody else to back him up. Like, I expect him to be a relatively low usage but high efficiency guy who is basically a catch and shoot threes and the occasional secondary attack as like the backup pick and roll when it gets kicked out, or maybe taking it to the basket off of one of those kickouts. That's who he is, and he does that very well, and that fits in well with the concept of what it seems like they're building in their starting lineup. If it's going to be Rose pick and rolls or Carmelo isolations or Carmelo pick and rolls or Noah facilitating from the elbows, it makes sense to have Courtney Lee spotting up or flying off screens and attacking closeouts, and that's what he does well. He's not going to rebound all that much. They have the Knicks. Carmelo over the last couple of years has stepped up his rebounding. Kristaps was a good rebounder last year. Noah's a good rebounder. They have their guys that are going to grab the rebounds. Even Rose for his position has in the past at times rebounded well. So I would imagine Lee is not going to rebound very much. He's not going to get very many assists. He'll do his work in passing lanes like he always does, steal and a half or so a night, and he'll play, like you said, good on-ball defense. But the touches I don't think will necessarily be there for the fantasy perspective, but on-court perspective for how he affects the Knicks offensively, I think it will be very much like he's done in Orlando and New Jersey and Houston and Boston and Memphis and Charlotte, where his gravity and his shooting and his ability to work off of screens, plays a big role for them, and it'll help them a lot. It's just not necessarily going to show up that big in his numbers.
Yeah, look, he's been a really, really impressive three-point shooter throughout his career. Like, he shot 38% last year, 40 the year before, 37, 40 over his last 5 years. So he's going to hit threes at a high rate. He's an efficient free throw shooter, like a very high percentage free throw shooter. He's been over 82% in each of the last 5 seasons. He's, in terms of field goal percentage as a shooting guard, he's pretty high up there, but the volume just isn't there, and he just doesn't do enough in those other categories. The steals are nice, but to me, he's just a deeper league player. He's not someone that, even though you might see him come in our rankings, and I think he's ranked 130th, I wouldn't be necessarily picking him there because I just don't see any upside for him to get better than that. That's just who he is. That's who he continues to be, and that's great, and it works really well in a team construct, but it just doesn't stand out in a statistical point of view.
Yeah, I think the upside comes in the case of injuries. Yeah. If Rose gets hurt, or especially if Carmelo gets hurt, then they're going to need somebody else in the perimeter to do more than what they're being counted on for. And Carmelo has missed a bunch of games the last few years. It's no guarantee that he plays even like 70 games or so. I think last year he played exactly 70, or he played 72 last year, but the year before he played 40. He had a 67-game season before that. Even the lockout season, he missed 11 games. So there's opportunity for him to do more, but I think it all depends on Rose or Carmelo getting hurt for an extended period of time.
The problem with, as you mentioned, Melo, if he gets hurt, then the guy that steps into his role is Lance Thomas, and he's very much in the Courtney Lee mold. He is not a high usage, high volume type of player, so someone has to absorb it. Noah's not a high usage guy; he doesn't absorb it.
Yes, so I would imagine it would be, Rose and Kristaps.
You would think they would get their usage bump. They might even get to 30% during that sort of time. But Lee would be the next guy that takes a leap up, because Lance Thomas just, for as good as he is and for as much of a solid team defender and good teammate and all that stuff that he just is not able to take on any sort of volume offensively. That'll have to fall into Lee's hands. So it is something worth monitoring, but drafting a guy late hoping that Melo gets injured maybe in February, it's not going to work out. Let's talk Melo now. He changed his game last season. I think that he gets roasted in a lot of areas, and he has throughout his career. But I have a lot of respect for Melo for what he does. I like this sort of don't give a shit Melo that's sort of happening at the moment. The comment he had to the fan about James Dolan last season, I really enjoy that. I like the fact that he's improved his rebounding, as you mentioned. He really got his assists up, and he started moving the ball more as well. He does a lot of things that people think, oh, he's a black hole, but he's just not that guy anymore. He's able to do a few extra things. How have you viewed this sort of evolution in Melo's game?
I'm of two minds about it, and that's something I feel like I've said a few different times on this podcast, because it's something I've always wanted to see from him, where he leverages the fact that he draws so much attention into finding spaces for other people on the court. But it's still, and this is something I wrote last season, like he was doing so much for them and playing so well, and because he showed you that he could do that, it lets you know that he could do so much more. Like he could be a consistent 5-6 assists a game guy if he dedicated himself to, instead of shooting 20 times a game and taking his one dribble step backs, or 3 or 4 shots near the basket on a possession. If he leveraged that attention into more of those cross court looks, or simple kickouts to kickstart ball movement, that maybe even the ball then comes back to him later on. And it's wonderful to see him play that way in the Olympics, where he's just sort of a sniper, or he's moving the ball. The talent level on the Knicks obviously is not nearly as high, and they need him to be a different kind of player. And would it be nice to see him play like he plays in the Olympics with the Knicks? Of course, but you need much better guys to facilitate that kind of play, and the Knicks just don't have that kind of talent to be able to see that on an every night basis.
He's still going to be a guy that's a 20-point plus per night scorer. He's going to get nice rebounds, good assists. He's a really, really solid fantasy guy in that third round sort of range. You'll see him ranked relatively highly on Yahoo, a bit lower on ESPN, but into the second round, third round, to get a guy that gets you 23, 24 points, there's just not many of those guys around, and getting him there, along with decent efficiency and nice contributions in other categories. The injuries are a concern, as you touched on, but I think he's going to continue just to be that same sort of guy with a few evolutions in his game, but the bulk of his stuff, what he does, it remains as it is, and I think that's a credit to him that he's been able to.
I think you'll get a nice boost from him in his 3-point shooting this year, though. I think that will come back up. He shot in 3 of his seasons with the Knicks in either the high 30s or the 40s. He was at 38% one year, 40%, 42% in that the stint of the season where he got traded to the Knicks. But then in his other 3 seasons, he's been 34%, 34%, 34%. So I would expect, just because, Kristaps drawing more attention, having a better passer at that other big man spot, and Noah having a point guard, whether it's Rose or Jennings, that attacks the basket and draws a little bit more attention. I would think that he'll be a little bit more open from 3 this year, and he's healthier this year as well. Coming into the season, he's not coming off an injury like he was last year, and he's not already hurt like he was 2 years ago. So I would think that he could get that 3-point percentage back up into the high 30s too.
Now, I know that my listeners are going to want me to talk to you about KOQ, because Kyle O'Quinn is one of my favorite players. I have this bunch of sort of guys that are my favorite players, and there's no real reason for it, but I'm a big O'Quinn fan, and I feel like the last 2 seasons he has been buried for no reason. And my correlation behind it is that he's played for 2 of the worst coaches in the NBA. In Orlando, he was playing under Jacques Vaughn, didn't see the court. Cool. Vaughn, you're a terrible coach, bad decision. Then he plays under Derek Fisher and Kurt Rambis, buried again. He is a guy that has shown, back in Orlando in that season before his last one there, when he was starting games for Nick Vucevic, and he was contributing. He stretched out a little bit to 3. He blocks a lot of shots. He gets a lot of rebounds. He's a solid offensive player. He's a good defender. And then they just didn't play him. And same thing in New York. Am I just completely misplaced in my faith for O'Quinn, or is it just Hornacek's going to go, you know what, this guy's actually really good. Let's get him on the court. Let's see how him and Kristaps work together. Let's see how this all goes.
I don't think you're necessarily misplaced. It's, things have happened sort of beyond his control. Like last year, early in the season, he had that backup big man job, and this is something that I've talked about in connection with him. He's a very high risk passer, so when he throws this really risky pass and it gets through, you're like, wow, that guy is such a talent. He looks great. Get him the ball more, let him facilitate. But then he throws a similar pass and it goes right into a guy's hands, and you're like, what is this guy doing on the court right now? And last year, because his playing time was inconsistent, he got very, very trigger happy with both his passes and especially with his jumper, where it seemed like every time he touched the ball, he was launching that mid-range jumper, and Fisher was just not having either one of those things, and sort of yanked him from the rotation in favor of Kevin Seraphin, then sort of shuffled the two of them back and forth, and it just was not good for either of them. So I do think that the talent is there. Like, he is capable of making good passes, and he's always been a good rebounder, especially on the defensive side of the court. So that could work for them. But the questions to me are, does he play within the offense? Because he's not a guy who's a foundational offensive player, even as the foundation of your bench unit. He's more of a supplementary kind of guy that moves the ball and can hit the jumper if it's there, rather than someone who you're running your offense through at the elbow and who should be jacking the jumper every time he touches the ball. And then the other question is, can he move his feet well enough defensively to justify being on the court? Because last year he really didn't do that at all.
Yeah, it seemed to me that at times he was. You referenced the jerking back and forward between Seraphin and O'Quinn, and that to me affects guys' confidence, and it affected both of those players, who I think are a lot better than what they showed last season. But yeah, he wasn't at his best, but we've seen that he can be a lot better than what he is, and he's definitely one of my favorite players for whatever reason. I don't know, maybe it's the beard. There's something about him that I really think
last year
exciting.
I think he struggled relatively compared to previous years, finishing in close, which was an issue as well.
Yeah, he's also got the widest name for a black man that I've probably ever heard.
Yeah, well, he would fit right in Boston.
Yes, exactly. He's part of that. I think Bill Simmons had the Reggie Cleveland All Stars. He's definitely in that in that group.
100%.
Yep, he's definitely in that group, because when you see that name, there's no chance that you think that he looks like that, but there he is, and he's definitely on board as one of my favorites. Lance Thomas. He signed a pretty hefty contract for a guy that came across to the Knicks early in 2014-15 season, and then was waived pretty much immediately, and then they re-signed him. What do you make of him at age 28 now? Is this just who he is? What was last season an aberration in terms of him playing better? Like, what do we make of a guy that bounced around the league for such a long time? The Knicks have already cut once and then re-signed and then signed to a big contract.
Well, the thing with the cut, he came over in the Iman Shumpert J.R. Smith trade, and they cut him and then signed him to a 10-day contract and then signed him for the rest of the year after that. So it was more like the mechanics. It wasn't like they were cutting him because they wanted to get rid of him. It was they were cutting him so they could get him on a different deal. So that was how that worked out. He's someone that when he was in New Orleans and Oklahoma City, and if you go back through my Twitter, you can see that I said this, like, I think he just knows where to be, and that's really valuable from a bench guy. He knows when to make his cuts and where. He knows where to be defensively within the team scheme, and he last year showed himself especially to be a very good one-on-one defender. And I think he made more threes last season than he had attempted in his entire basketball career, NBA and college combined.
That happened for a lot of players last season.
I don't think he made a three at all at Duke. And he made 44 last season after having 7 in his career before that. Shot 40% from three on the year. Was starting to cool down a little bit before he wound up being out for the year, but that was partially because he was injured. I think if he can maintain the mid-30s even, that makes him a very useful bench guy for the Knicks, not necessarily a all that useful of a fantasy guy because I don't know if he'll play more than 20, 25 or so minutes a game. But being able to knock down that three off the kick out, grab some rebounds, make some cuts. Last year, even showed on occasion the ability to make some smart passes. So it makes him a very useful player within their team scheme if he can maintain that shooting. He's also just a really good dude, which is it's always nice to see that kind of guy succeed.
He's the opposite of former Knicks point guard of the future Tony Roden, in that he's a much better real life basketball player than what he is a fantasy player. Whereas Roden is one of the worst basketball players that's played in the NBA in the last couple of years, but he would rack up stats at the detriment to everything else that was happening on the team. But Thomas is a guy that even if he played 32 minutes, I don't think he'd even come close to cracking the top 150 in fantasy. He just does everything right, but it doesn't accumulate stats, and that's why teammates love him. But from a fantasy point of view, then he's just completely irrelevant in that sort of a sense. If we look at
so much of his value comes from like filling in the spaces between stars on the team do, and that's something that sometimes shows up in the box score, sometimes doesn't, but often does not show up in the fantasy box score, and but is incredibly important to actual on-court success, especially when he winds up playing in like those mixed lineups with the starters.
Let's talk breakout candidates, Jared. I don't think there's a pretty obvious one that we can look at.
Yeah, there's only one, and it's a very obvious one.
There's no one else apart from Kristaps, is there?
No. I mean, most of the other guys that are going to factor into the rotation are, well-known commodities and in their late 20s or 30s, So, I mean, this is really the only guy that's a surefire, high-minute guy that is before his physical prime. He's still 20. He's 7 years away from, the statistical physical prime. He's got room to grow. Improvement is not necessarily always linear, so it's certainly possible that he doesn't make a big jump this year. But I think it's more likely that he is improved than that he stays the same. And I think that that's a pretty safe assumption, and probably the consensus assumption as well.
Yeah, I can't see any way that he gets significantly worse. He did have a bit of a drop-off towards the end of the season, but there's a couple of reasons. He was battling shoulder issues, and he was also battling Kurt Rambis, because Rambis was playing...
Battling Kurt Rambis, and the fact that, the most number of games he had ever played in a season before last year, I think, was like 31. And he played 72 games last year. I think he played the first, 55 or 60, all of them in a row. Before he missed a game against Detroit, I think was in January. Played the first 47 games of the season, sat out a game against Detroit, then played another, I think, 15 or so games, and then at that point started missing a couple here and there, and then sat out, I think, the last 7 games of the season. Yeah. Wound up playing 72, which was more than double his previous high.
He was just used horribly down the stretch as well, with Rambis refusing to use him in a pick and pop situation. He was continuing trying to post him up, floating out thoughts of playing him at the 3, just stuff that just didn't work in Porzingis' favour whatsoever. He is the obvious breakout. Look, there's plenty of rookies on this team, as I mentioned. There's Hernan Gomez, there's Kuzminskas, there is Plumlee, Ndua, Randall, then there could be Tokoto, Baker. All these guys haven't played in the NBA, so it's hard to predict breakouts from guys we've never seen play, and that is what's...
They also just, none of them has a really defined role with the team. Like, one or two of them might play, 10, 15 minutes a night, but you don't know who it's going to be. So it's hard to call any of them a real breakout candidate.
What's your bold prediction for this team? It can be anything that you want, Jared. You can mention a trade. You can say a big decline from a player. You could say anything. A player, slips into the front row of the crowd and Spike Lee breaks his leg. It can be whatever sort of bold prediction you want.
That's a good question. I hadn't thought about this before the podcast, so I'm going to have to completely freelance one. say, I'll go with the one that I said was possible before. Completely bowled out of nowhere. That Brandon Jennings winds up being, a more relevant, I guess, for your fantasy purposes, point guard than Derrick Rose. Whether it's because of injury or ineffectiveness, just doesn't see the court enough for the opposite to be true.
Fair enough. That's what we want from our bold predictions. I think we've covered everyone on the Knicks here. Jared, anything you want to add about this team?
No, that all covers it. I think to me, I guess this I'll throw out there because of the Courtney Lee quote that you opened the podcast with.
Yep.
I do want to say that obviously what else do you expect him to say? Like,
Exactly.
of course he's going to say we're contenders. To me, the thing that would make the season a success is, and this is something I've said on the Locked On Knicks podcast as well. If when Lee, Carmelo, Kristaps, and Noah are on the court together, if they're above average on offense and defense with those four guys on the court, that's a successful season to me, and that's all I want to see, because none of the other guys is necessarily going to be there long term, and that would show that the foundation of their starting lineup is on the road towards success. And if you got a star point guard in there, that a guy who's still a star point guard and not a star named point guard, so if you got one of those guys in there, then they could maybe push into the top 10 on both sides, which then would make them the contender that Courtney Lee says they are.
Well, there you go. That's I think they're reasonable expectations, and Knicks fans, don't be expecting championships, but you're just looking for progress. You're looking for hope and growth, and I think I think we're going to see a huge season from Porzingis especially, and that's enough to get. We saw a huge season from him last season, but I think he does really start to. And we talk about maybe he's the third option behind Rose. There's a chance that he plays well enough that they make him look. He has to be the second option, and Rose just has to go, cool, I've just got to get this guy the ball, because he is just driving everything here, and that's a real situation that could occur, I think.
I think it could occur. I don't know if necessarily Rose is wired that way, and it's something that I am very much looking forward to asking him when camp starts, is sort of, because the Knicks have this guy who they obviously want so much of and is huge for the future of the franchise. And he's a big man and obviously is dependent on his guards to get him the ball. I would very much like to know how much responsibility Rose feels that for Kristaps' development and for getting him involved, and how that will affect the way he plays his own game. So I'm interested to see how that plays out.
Well, once you ask Derek that question, I'm sure that you'll have the information on the Locked On Knicks podcast, Jared. So I do recommend that everyone goes and listens to that podcast, subscribes to it, and checks out all Knicks information that's coming via you. Let's wrap it up. Plug your Twitter handle and anything that you might have coming up that you want people to know about.
Sure, yeah. I'm on Twitter at JADubin5. You can follow the podcast on Twitter as well, at Locked On Knicks. Keep an eye out. I'll have another podcast, possibly 2 next week. Check out the ones we did this week with Matt Moore and Chris Herring. And my writing is all over the place. If you follow me on Twitter, I send out links all the time. And there's a link in my bio that shows you all of my archives at the various sites I write for. So that's probably the easiest way to find my stuff.
Yeah, so check out Jared there on Twitter. I'm sure you're already following him, but if you're not, follow him. Check out the Locked On Knicks podcast and leave a review. As I said, do the same for this podcast. You can find both of our shows on iTunes, on Stitcher, on TuneIn, on Google Play. So however you want to consume the podcast, it's there for you. Do it, subscribe. I'm sure you won't be disappointed. Jared, thank you for taking the time to come on and talk about the Knicks with me today.
Sure thing, man. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. See ya.
All right, I got to head out. Just let me know when that